The storm hit Millbrook County like the wrath of God himself, tearing through the small southern town with winds that howled like banshees and rain that fell in torrents thick as curtains. Lightning split the purple-black sky in jagged scars, illuminating the empty main street where awnings flapped wildly and trash cans rolled like tumbleweeds. Inside Louise's diner, the fluorescent lights flickered with each thunderclap, casting dancing shadows across the worn linoleum floor and faded red vinyl booths that had seen better decades. Grandma Louise Washington stood barely 5 feet tall behind the counter, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, her brown eyes sharp and kind despite her 73 years. The storm raged outside her windows, but inside, warmth radiated from the old gas stove, where a pot of coffee percolated steadily. She had weathered storms before literal ones, and the kind that came with being a black woman running a business in small-town Georgia. Tonight felt different though, heavier somehow, as if the universe was preparing to test her in ways she could never imagine. The diner had been her sanctuary for 37 years, ever since her husband Robert passed and left her with nothing but recipes, determination, and a building that leaked when it rained hard enough. She had poured her soul into this place, serving sweet tea and homemade biscuits to truckers, locals, and anyone else who needed a warm meal and a kind word. But tonight, as the storm intensified, she found herself completely alone. The last customer had fled an hour ago when the weather service issued tornado warnings. Even her regular, old Mr. Henderson, who came every evening for coffee and apple pie, had hurried home to secure his shutters. Louise could have closed early, could have locked up and retreated to her small apartment above the diner. Instead, she stayed, driven by an instinct she couldn't quite name, a feeling that someone might need her light in the darkness. She wiped down the counter for the 4th time, her movements methodical and soothing. The coffee maker gurgled, and the old radio crackled with emergency broadcasts between bursts of static. Outside, the wind pushed against the building like invisible hands, testing its resolve. Louise had reinforced these walls herself over the years, patching cracks and painting over water stains, making this place not just a business but a fortress of hospitality in a world that could be cruel and cold. The people of Millbrook knew her as more than just the woman who ran the diner. She was the lady who fed the homeless when they passed through town, who never turned away a hungry child, who kept a jar of quarters by the register for those who came up short. Some folks whispered that she was too generous for her own good, that kindness was a luxury she couldn't afford. But Louise had learned long ago that kindness wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity, the very thing that separated human beings from the howling wind outside. As another crack of thunder shook the building, Louise pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders and checked the clock. 9:30. The storm was supposed to last until dawn, and she had nowhere else to be. This was her place, her purpose, her stand against a world that often forgot the power of simple human decency. She had no idea that in the next few minutes, 9 strangers would test that decency in ways that would change not just her life, but the entire town of Millbrook forever. The storm seemed to intensify with each passing hour, as if nature herself was orchestrating something biblical. Rain hammered against the windows of Louise's diner with such ferocity that the glass bowed inward, and Louise found herself grateful for the metal security grates she'd installed years ago after a break-in attempt. The parking lot had become a shallow lake, reflecting the intermittent flashes of lightning that turned the world strobing white for split seconds before plunging it back into darkness. Inside, the warmth felt almost sacred. Louise moved between her stations with practiced grace, checking the coffee, stirring a pot of vegetable soup that simmered on the back burner, arranging clean mugs on the counter like soldiers ready for duty. The familiar routines calmed her nerves, even as the building groaned and creaked around her like an old ship riding out a hurricane. The radio dispatcher's voice cut through the static with increasing urgency. All residents are advised to seek immediate shelter. Wind speeds have reached 75 miles per hour with gusts up to 90. Downed power lines reported throughout the county. Emergency services are suspended until the storm passes. Louise reached over and turned down the volume, not wanting to hear any more dire predictions. She had lived through Hurricane Hugo back in '89, and this felt similar, that same electric tension in the air, the same sense that the very atmosphere was being torn apart and reassembled. But she had survived that night, and she would survive this one too. A particularly violent gust of wind caught the diner's sign outside, and Louise heard the metal groaning against its chains. She had painted that sign herself just 5 years ago, carefully lettering Louise's Diner in cheerful yellow against a red background. It had welcomed thousands of travelers over the years, a beacon of comfort to anyone who needed a place to rest and refuel. Tonight, it swayed wildly in the wind like a flag of surrender, but it held firm. The lights flickered again, longer this time, and Louise instinctively reached for the flashlight she kept beneath the register. She had candles too, lined up on a shelf in the back, and a camping lantern that Robert had bought decades ago for fishing trips they never got to take. She was prepared for whatever the night might bring, the way a person learns to be prepared when they've spent their whole life taking care of others. Thunder rolled across the sky like bowling balls down heaven's lanes, and Louise found herself thinking about the strange patterns of fate. How many nights had she stood in this exact spot, serving coffee and comfort to travelers caught in storms? How many strangers had found refuge within these walls, grateful for a warm meal and a dry place to wait out nature's fury? She couldn't have known that this particular storm was about to deliver 9 visitors who would challenge every assumption her neighbors held about grace, prejudice, and the transformative power of unconditional kindness. All she knew was that the storm was getting worse, and if anyone needed help tonight, her door would be open, because that's what Louise Washington did. She opened doors, filled bellies, and proved every single day that love was stronger than fear, even when the whole world seemed to be falling apart outside. The roar of motorcycle engines cut through the storm like chainsaws through silk. At first, Louise thought it might be thunder, but the sound was too rhythmic, too mechanical. She looked toward the front windows, trying to peer through the sheets of rain, and saw headlights approaching, not the steady beams of cars, but the scattered, moving lights of motorcycles navigating the flooded street. 9 Harley-Davidsons pulled into her parking lot, their chrome exhausts spitting steam as rain hit the hot metal. The riders dismounted quickly, silhouettes in black leather against the lightning-lit sky. Even through the storm, Louise could see their patches, the distinctive winged death's head of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, embroidered on their backs like declarations of war, against a world that had never understood them. The men who approached her door were soaked to the bone, their leather jackets streaming water, their boots splashing through puddles that reflected the diner's neon sign. They moved with the measured confidence of people accustomed to being feared, their shoulders broad, beneath cut-off vests that displayed an array of patches telling stories. Louise couldn't read, but somehow understood tales of brotherhood, rebellion, and miles traveled on the edges of society. The lead rider reached the door first. He stood about 6 feet tall with graying hair slicked back by rain, a beard that reached his chest, and arms covered in tattoos that disappeared beneath his soaked sleeves. His name was Marcus Tank Rodriguez, though Louise wouldn't learn that until much later. All she saw was a human being seeking shelter from the storm. He hesitated at the door, his hand hovering over the handle. Through the glass, he could see the small black woman behind the counter, her expression calm and curious rather than frightened. Most people crossed the street when they saw him coming. Most business owners locked their doors and pretended to be closed. But this woman just stood there, waiting to see what he would do. Behind him, his brothers, for that's how they thought of each other, shuffled and stamped, eager to get out of the rain. There was Jimmy Bones Thompson, a Vietnam veteran with haunted eyes and gentle hands. Danny Diesel O'Brien, barely 25, and still proving himself to the older members. Marcus Tiny Williams, who stood 6'6" and weighed 300 pounds, but had never raised his hand in anger against anyone who didn't deserve it. Snake, Phoenix, Roadkill, Bull, and Hammer, names that told stories of highways traveled and battles fought, both literal and metaphorical. They were outlaws by choice and circumstance, men who had found family where society said family couldn't exist. They lived by codes that polite society didn't understand, but their loyalty to each other was absolute. Tonight, though, they were just 9 human beings caught in a storm, seeking the same basic shelter that any creature would need. Tank finally opened the door, and they filed in like something out of a fever dream, water dripping from their jackets, boots squeaking against the linoleum, the smell of leather and rain, and motor oil filling the small space. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made their tattoos look like ancient war paint. Louise watched them settle into booths and chairs, their movements careful and deliberate. She had never seen real Hells Angels before, though she'd heard the stories, tales of violence and criminality that were half truth, half legend, and entirely designed to keep people afraid. But looking at them now, dripping wet and grateful to be out of the storm, all she saw were 9 men who needed what she had always provided: warmth, food, and basic human kindness. She walked out from behind the counter, coffee pot in hand, and approached their table with the same calm grace she'd shown to thousands of customers over the years. "Coffee?" she asked simply, her voice steady and warm. Tank looked up at her, surprised by the lack of fear in her eyes, the absence of judgment in her tone. In truck stops and diners across the country, they were usually met with suspicion at best, outright hostility at worst. But this woman, this small black grandmother in rural Georgia, was offering them coffee like they were neighbors dropping by for a chat. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly. "That would be mighty kind of you." Louise began pouring, moving from cup to cup with practiced efficiency. The coffee was fresh and strong, and steam rose from each mug like incense in a cathedral. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the building, but inside, something else was beginning, a quiet miracle that would ripple through Millbrook County for years to come. Because sometimes, in the midst of the worst storms, unexpected angels find their way to exactly where they need to be. The coffee warmed them from the inside out, but it was Louise's manner that truly drove away the chill. She moved between the kitchen and dining room like a conductor orchestrating a symphony of comfort, never asking questions, never making assumptions. When Tank mentioned they hadn't eaten since morning, she simply nodded and began preparing food, not the minimal effort of someone doing a job, but the careful attention of someone who understood that a hot meal could mean the difference between despair and hope. She ladled homemade vegetable soup into bowls, the broth rich with carrots, potatoes, and celery that had been simmering all day. She buttered thick slices of cornbread, golden and crumbly, the kind that soaked up soup and memories in equal measure. She refilled coffee cups without being asked, and when Diesel shivered in his wet clothes, she disappeared upstairs and returned with an armload of blankets, old quilts that her grandmother had made, faded but warm, smelling faintly of lavender and mothballs. "Now don't you worry about getting them wet," she said, distributing the blankets among the 9 men. "They've seen worse than a little rainwater." The bikers accepted her offerings with a humility that would have surprised anyone who knew their reputations on the road. These were men who commanded respect through presence and history, who had spent their lives proving they needed nothing from anyone. But here, in this small diner with this remarkable woman, they allowed themselves to be cared for. Tiny, the gentle giant, wrapped a quilt around his massive shoulders and closed his eyes. "Ma'am," he said in a voice like distant thunder, "this reminds me of my grandmother's kitchen. Haven't felt this kind of warm in 20 years. Jimmy Bones Thompson stared into his coffee cup, steam fogging his glasses. The soup was bringing back memories of his mother, who had died while he was overseas. She used to make soup just like this on cold nights, used to wrap him in quilts when he was sick. He hadn't thought about those moments in decades, had buried them beneath layers of trauma and survival. But sitting here, being tended to by this woman who asked nothing in return, those gentle memories surfaced like spring flowers after a long winter. Louise noticed his tears and said nothing, simply refilled his coffee, and patted his shoulder, a gesture so natural and maternal that it nearly broke his composure entirely. She had a gift for seeing what people needed before they knew they needed it, for providing comfort in precisely the right measure. As the night wore on, the conversation grew easier. They told her about their journey. They had been riding back from a memorial service for a fallen brother in Tennessee, trying to make it to Florida before the storm hit. They shared stories of the road, of places they'd been and people they'd met, carefully editing out the parts that might frighten her. She listened with genuine interest, asking questions about their motorcycles, their travels, their families. When Snake mentioned he hadn't spoken to his daughter in 5 years, Louise simply said, "It's never too late to pick up the phone." When Phoenix talked about his struggle to find work with his criminal record, she nodded and said, "A man's past don't define his future, son. What matters is what he chooses to do today." Around midnight, the storm reached its peak. The building shook with each gust of wind, and the lights flickered so frequently that Louise finally lit her candles and placed them around the diner. In the soft golden glow, the 9 bikers looked less like outlaws and more like lost souls who had found an unexpected sanctuary. Danny Diesel O'Brien, the youngest of the group, found himself opening up to Louise in ways he hadn't with anyone, not even his brothers in the club. He told her about his mother, who had died of cancer when he was 16, how he'd been angry at the world ever since, how he'd found family with the Hells Angels, but still felt lost sometimes, still wondered if he was worthy of the love they showed him. Louise listened without judgment, occasionally murmuring words of encouragement. When he finished, she said simply, "Your mama would be proud of the man you've become. Sometimes the best families are the ones we choose, not the ones we're born into." As dawn approached, the storm began to weaken. The wind died down to a whisper, and the rain gentled to a steady patter against the windows. The 9 men had dozed fitfully in their chairs, wrapped in Louise's quilts, lulled by the sound of her humming as she moved around the kitchen preparing for the morning rush that might or might not come. When Tank woke, he found Louise standing at the window, watching the first pale light of sunrise struggle through the dissipating clouds. She had been awake all night, tending to them like a mother watching over sick children, never complaining, never asking for anything in return. "Ma'am," he said quietly, not wanting to wake the others. "We can't ever repay what you've done for us tonight." Louise turned and smiled, her face tired but peaceful. "Honey," she said, "kindness isn't something you repay, it's something you pass along." Tank reached into his wallet and pulled out all the money. He had nearly $300 and placed it on the counter. The others, awakening one by one, did the same. By the time they were ready to leave, There was over $1,000 in tips on Louise's counter, more money than she typically made in a month. But money wasn't what made this night remarkable. What made it remarkable was the quiet transformation that had occurred in those dark hours, 9 hardened outlaws, remembering what it felt like to be human, to be cared for, without conditions. And one small woman proving once again that love was the most powerful force in the universe, capable of bridging any divide, healing any wound, transforming any heart that was brave enough to accept it. As they prepared to leave, each man hugged Louise goodbye, awkward, heartfelt embraces that spoke of genuine affection and gratitude. They promised to stay in touch, to remember this night, to carry her kindness with them wherever the road might lead. Louise stood in her doorway, watching them mount their motorcycles, as the sun painted the wet parking lot gold. The storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and bright with possibility. She waved as they rode away, their engines echoing off the empty buildings, their taillights disappearing around the bend like red stars, fading into morning. She had no way of knowing that this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. The morning after the storm, Millbrook County looked like a battlefield. Fallen trees blocked roads, power lines sagged like broken dreams, and debris scattered across yards and parking lots told the story of nature's overnight rampage. Louise surveyed the damage around her diner with the pragmatic eye of someone who had weathered many storms, both literal and metaphorical. A few shingles had blown off the roof, and the parking lot was littered with branches and trash, but the building itself had held firm. She spent the early hours cleaning up, sweeping water from the floor where rain had found its way through a loose window seal, replacing the burnt-out fluorescent bulb that had finally given up during the night's electrical surges. The blankets the bikers had used were bundled into the washing machine upstairs, though she found herself holding each one for a moment, remembering the grateful faces of the men who had found comfort in their warmth. The money they had left still sat on the counter where they'd placed it, more cash than Louise had seen at one time in years. She counted it carefully, shaking her head in amazement. It was enough to fix the roof, replace the broken coffee machine, maybe even put new vinyl on the booth seats that had been patched with duct tape for longer than she cared to remember. But even as she planned how to use their unexpected generosity, Louise found herself thinking about the men themselves, Tank with his quiet dignity, Tiny with his gentle soul, young Diesel with his hidden pain. She wondered where they were now, whether they had made it safely to their destination. Whether they would remember their night in her diner as fondly as she would remember having them. Around 9 o'clock, her first customer of the day arrived. Harold Winters, who owned the hardware store down the street, pushed through the door with the harried look of a man who had spent the morning cleaning up storm damage. He was a regular, had been coming to the diner for coffee and gossip for 15 years, and Louise could read his moods like a favorite book. "Morning, Harold," she called from behind the counter. "Coffee? Please," he said, settling onto his usual stool. "What a night, Louise. Lost half my gutters, and the sign in front of the store. You make out okay?" "Can't complain," Louise replied, pouring his coffee. "Building held together just fine." Harold took a sip and looked around the diner, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Heard you had some unusual customers last night." Louise's hand paused over the coffee pot. News traveled fast in a small town, especially news that involved the kind of visitors who didn't usually stop in Millbrook. "Oh?" Jimmy Patterson was driving home from his shift at the plant, said he saw a bunch of motorcycles parked out front. Hell's Angels, from what he could tell. Harold's voice carried the tone of someone sharing scandalous information. "Said they were in here for hours." Louise resumed pouring, her expression calm. "They were caught in the storm. Needed a place to wait it out." "Louise," Harold said, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a caring whisper. "Those people are dangerous. You can't just let them in here like they're regular customers. What if they had robbed you? What if they had hurt you?" The coffee pot clicked as Louise set it back on the warmer. She turned to face Harold, her brown eyes steady and patient. "Harold, they were 9 men caught in a storm. I gave them coffee and soup and a dry place to sit. That's what I do here. That's what I've always done." "But Louise, they were perfect gentlemen," she said firmly. "Polite, grateful, and they paid their bill fair and square. More than fair, actually." Harold shifted uncomfortably on his stool. He had known Louise for years, had always respected her judgment, but this seemed different. This seemed dangerous. "People are talking, Louise. They're worried about you. About what might happen if word gets out that this place welcomes their kind. Their kind." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a fire that wouldn't die. Louise had heard those words before, spoken about people who looked like her, people who worshipped differently, people who loved differently. Always their kind, as if kindness itself had borders that couldn't be crossed. "Harold," she said quietly, I've been serving their kind for 37 years. Every kind. Truckers and teachers, sinners and saints, people with money and people without. The only kind I don't serve is the kind that brings hatred through my door. Harold finished his coffee in uncomfortable silence and left $1 on the counter, his usual tip, no more, no less. As he reached the door, he turned back. Just be careful, Louise. That's all I'm saying. Just be careful. After he left, Louise stood alone in her diner, watching the morning sun stream through windows that needed washing, listening to the familiar hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of chainsaws as the town began cleaning up from the storm. She thought about Harold's words, about the fear in his voice, about the assumptions people made about others they'd never met. She thought about Tank's quiet thank you, about Tiny's gentle smile, about young Diesel's tears when she'd told him his mother would be proud. She thought about the blankets they'd wrapped themselves in, and the careful way they'd folded them before leaving, the respect they'd shown for her space and her kindness. And she knew, with the certainty that comes from 73 years of living and loving and learning, that she had done exactly the right thing. Not because it was easy, not because it was popular, but because it was what her heart and her conscience demanded. Outside, Millbrook County was cleaning up from the storm. Inside Louise's diner, something else was settling into place, a quiet resolve, a deep knowing that kindness was never wrong, even when the world insisted it was dangerous. Especially when the world insisted it was dangerous. Word spread through Millbrook like spilled coffee, seeping into every corner, staining every conversation. By noon, everyone in town knew about Louise's overnight guests. The story grew with each telling, becoming more dramatic, more dangerous, more scandalous with every whispered retelling in the grocery store aisles and gas station parking lots. At Murphy's barber shop, the afternoon regulars dissected the situation with the intensity of surgeons. 9 of them, said Eddie Murphy, snipping away at Mayor Thompson's thinning hair. Can you imagine? Hell's Angels, right here in Millbrook. I heard they threatened her, made her serve them. That's not what I heard, interrupted Bill Kowalski, waiting his turn in the cracked leather chair by the window. I heard she welcomed them in like they were family. Like she'd lost her mind. Mayor Thompson, a soft man who had built his political career on avoiding controversy, shifted uncomfortably under the barber's cape. Louise Washington has always been different, he said carefully. Independent. But this shows poor judgment. What if they come back? What if they bring others? The conversation continued in this vein throughout the afternoon, fear and speculation mixing into a toxic brew that poisoned the town's perception of the previous night's events. At the Piggly Wiggly, cashiers whispered to customers about the danger Louise had put the whole town in. At the post office, clerk Martha Henderson told anyone who would listen that she was considering filing a complaint with the sheriff's department. Some folks, though, remembered Louise differently. They remembered the free meals she'd provided during the recession of '08, when half the town was out of work. They remembered the way she'd stayed open Christmas Day to serve dinner to anyone who had nowhere else to go. They remembered her kindness to their children, their elderly parents, their struggling relatives. But even those who defended her felt uneasy. The Hells Angels were not homeless families or lonely seniors. They were outlaws with a reputation that stretched across every highway in America. Surely Louise, for all her good intentions, had crossed a line this time. As the day wore on, the effects became visible. 3 regular customers who usually stopped by for lunch found reasons to eat elsewhere. The afternoon coffee crowd, typically 5 or 6 retirees who gathered to solve the world's problems over endless refills, was noticeably smaller. When Mrs. Patterson came by for her usual slice of apple pie, she sat at the counter instead of her preferred booth, positioned so she could see the door. Louise noticed. Of course she noticed. She had been reading people's moods and fears for decades, had survived as a black businesswoman in the South by understanding the subtle signs of trouble before they became obvious. But she said nothing, simply continued serving food and coffee with the same grace she'd always shown. The same warmth that had made her diner a second home to 3 generations of Millbrook residents. Around 4 o'clock, Sheriff Bobby Mitchell pushed through the door, his substantial frame filling the entrance. He was a good man, fair and steady, but he carried the weight of a town's concerns on his shoulders. He settled onto a stool at the counter, removed his hat, and rubbed his balding head in the gesture Louise recognized as his way of preparing for a difficult conversation. "Coffee, Bobby?" she asked, already reaching for the pot. "Please," he said. "Louise, I need to ask you about last night." She poured his coffee and set the cup in front of him, along with the small pitcher of cream he always used. "What would you like to know?" 9 bikers stayed here during the storm. Hells Angels. Yes. Any trouble? Anything I need to know about? Louise looked at the sheriff, this man who had eaten her coconut cake at every church social for 20 years, who had once helped her change a flat tire in the parking lot during a thunderstorm. No trouble, Bobby. They were perfect gentlemen. He nodded, sipping his coffee. People are concerned, Louise. Nervous. You know how small towns can be. I do. They're worried about precedent. About what happens if word gets out that Millbrook is friendly to that kind of element. That kind of element. There it was again, that phrase that reduced human beings to categories, that made fear seem reasonable and prejudice seem practical. Bobby, Louise said, wiping down the counter between them, those men were cold and wet and far from home. I gave them shelter. That's what people do for each other, or at least it's what they should do. I understand that, Louise. I do. But you have to see how it looks to folks. The Hells Angels aren't exactly known for their charitable work. Louise paused in her wiping, her brown eyes meeting his. What are they known for, Bobby? Really? What do you actually know about those specific 9 men who sat in my diner last night? The sheriff considered this. Well, they're criminals. Drug dealers, probably. Violent. Are they? Did you run their plates? Check their records? Or are you just repeating what people assume about them? Bobby Mitchell had been sheriff for 12 years, long enough to know that assumptions were dangerous things. He also knew Louise Washington well enough to recognize when she was making a point that deserved consideration. I haven't checked anything, he admitted. Haven't had any reports of trouble, either. Couple of folks said they saw them leave this morning. Calm as you please. Because they were calm, Louise said. They were grateful. They left a generous tip and cleaned up after themselves and shook my hand goodbye, like the gentlemen they were. The sheriff finished his coffee in silence, thinking about fear and facts, about the difference between reputation and reality. When he stood to leave, he placed a $5 bill on the counter, more than double what he usually left. Louise, he said, settling his hat back on his head, you be careful, you hear? Not because I think those bikers were dangerous, but because sometimes the most dangerous thing in a small town is being different. After he left, Louise stood alone in her diner as the afternoon light slanted through the windows, painting everything golden and warm. She thought about fear and love, about the choices people made when they had to choose between them. She thought about 9 men who had needed shelter and the town that couldn't understand why she had provided it. And she prepared for whatever tomorrow might bring, because Louise Washington had never backed down from doing what she believed was right, no matter how many people told her she was wrong. The truth was, though, that she felt more alone than she had in years. Evening crept across Millbrook like a cat stalking prey, bringing with it the kind of silence that felt heavy with anticipation. Louise had served only 12 customers all day, far fewer than usual for a Saturday, when the diner typically buzzed with families grabbing dinner after Little League games and teenagers pooling their money for milkshakes and fries. She tried not to let it bother her. Business had been slow before, would be slow again. People had short memories when it came to controversy, and shorter attention spans when it came to judging their neighbors. Give it a week, maybe 2, and things would return to normal. But as she cleaned the grill and restocked the napkin dispensers, Louise couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in her relationship with the town she'd called home for over 40 years. She had crossed an invisible line, violated an unspoken rule, and now she was paying the price for her transgression. The thing was, she couldn't bring herself to regret it. Even facing the prospect of lost customers and damaged relationships, even knowing that some people would always see her actions as foolish or dangerous, she knew she had done the right thing. Those 9 men had needed help, and she had helped them. It was as simple and as complicated as that. Around 8 o'clock, as she was preparing to close for the evening, the door chimed and Jenny Patterson walked in. Jenny was Harold's daughter-in-law, a young woman in her 30s with 2 small children and a husband who worked double shifts at the automotive plant. She had been a regular customer for 5 years, always ordering the same thing: grilled cheese and tomato soup, comfort food that reminded her of her own grandmother's cooking. But tonight, Jenny looked uncomfortable, her usual friendly smile replaced by an expression of nervous determination. She slid onto a stool at the counter and fidgeted with her purse strap. "Evening, Jenny," Louise said warmly. "The usual?" "Actually," Jenny said, her voice tight, "I just came to talk." Louise set down the dish rag she'd been holding and gave Jenny her full attention. "I'm listening. Miss Louise, I've been coming here for years. You've been nothing but kind to me and my family. When Tommy was out of work last winter, you let us eat here on credit until he got back on his feet. You've watched my kids while I ran errands, given them free cookies when they were good, hugged me when my daddy died." Louise nodded, remembering all of those moments, the small kindnesses that had built their relationship over time. But last night, Jenny continued, her voice growing stronger, you put this whole town at risk. Those men you sheltered, they're criminals, Miss Louise. Everybody knows what the Hells Angels are capable of. What if they had hurt you? What if they had decided to rob you, or worse? What if they come back with more of their friends? Louise listened without interrupting, recognizing the genuine fear in Jenny's voice. The concern that came from a place of caring rather than simple prejudice. And now, Jenny went on, my kids are asking questions. They heard the other kids at school talking about the bad men who came to Miss Louise's diner. They're scared to come here anymore. They don't understand why you would help people who might hurt them. The words hit Louise harder than she expected. She had watched Jenny's children grow up, had celebrated their birthdays with free ice cream and their good report cards with extra whipped cream on their hot chocolate. The thought that they were now afraid to come to her diner was almost unbearable. Jenny, Louise said quietly, I understand your concerns. I do. But those men weren't the monsters you think they were. They were human beings caught in a storm, and they needed help. How do you know? Jenny asked, her voice rising slightly. How do you know they weren't planning something? How do you know they won't come back? Louise considered the question seriously. How did she know? What evidence did she have, beyond her own instincts and the behavior she had witnessed during those dark hours? I know, she said finally, because I looked into their eyes. I listened to their stories. I watched how they treated me, how they treated my space, how they treated each other. I know because kindness recognizes kindness, and fear recognizes fear, and what I saw in those men wasn't something to be afraid of. Jenny shook her head, frustration evident in her expression. That's not enough, Miss Louise. You can't risk everyone's safety based on feelings and instincts. What if you're wrong? What if I'm right? Louise countered gently. What if those 9 men needed exactly what I gave them, a chance to be seen as human beings instead of monsters? What if the real danger isn't in showing kindness to strangers, but in letting fear make us forget how to be kind at all? They sat in silence for a moment, 2 women who cared about each other, but couldn't bridge the gap between their worldviews. Finally, Jenny stood up, her movements sharp with unresolved tension. I hope you're right, Miss Louise, she said. I really do. But I can't take that chance with my children's safety. I'm sorry, but we won't be coming back until this blows over. After Jenny left, Louise sat alone in her diner, surrounded by empty booths and the ghosts of countless conversations. She thought about the children who were now afraid to visit her, about the customers who had found reasons to eat elsewhere, about the town that had turned its back on her for the crime of showing compassion. For the first time since the storm, Louise Washington wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. But only for a moment. Because deep in her heart, in the place where her truest convictions lived, she knew that kindness was never a mistake, even when it came with a cost she hadn't expected to pay. Outside, the evening stars appeared one by one in the clear sky, silent witnesses to a small-town struggle between love and fear, between the way things had always been and the way they could be. And somewhere out there, 9 men who had been touched by grace were carrying that grace with them down highways that stretched toward tomorrow. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of pristine post-storm sky that made everything look washed and new. Louise arrived at the diner early, as was her custom, and spent the quiet hours before opening, preparing for what she expected would be another slow day. She mixed batter for pancakes, sliced fresh fruit, and brewed the first pot of coffee, finding comfort in the familiar routines that had anchored her life for nearly 4 decades. The breakfast crowd was smaller than usual, just a handful of early risers and 2 families passing through town on their way to Atlanta. The locals who did come in were polite but distant, their conversations subdued and careful. Louise served them with her usual grace, but she could feel the invisible walls that had been erected between herself and her community, barriers built from fear and misunderstanding. Around 10 o'clock, as she was refilling the coffee station, Louise became aware of a distant rumble that seemed to be growing louder. At first, she dismissed it as a truck convoy on the interstate, but the sound had a different quality, deeper, more rhythmic, almost musical in its complexity. Other customers noticed it too. Conversations paused as people turned toward the windows, trying to identify the source of the approaching noise. The rumble grew stronger, closer, until it filled the air like thunder that wouldn't stop. Then they appeared. Motorcycles. Not 9 this time, but dozens. They came around the bend in the highway like a mechanical river, chrome gleaming in the morning sun, engines synchronized in a symphony of controlled power. Harley-Davidsons stretched in a line that seemed to go on forever, 50, 60, 70 bikes, maybe more, all bearing the distinctive patches of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. The few customers in the diner froze, their coffee cups halfway to their lips, their eyes wide with a mixture of fascination and terror. Through the windows, they watched as the motorcycles pulled into the parking lot with military precision, filling every available space and spilling out onto the street beyond. Louise stood behind her counter, her heart pounding not with fear, but with a strange mixture of anticipation and wonder. Somehow, she wasn't surprised. Somehow, she had been expecting this. The engines fell silent one by one, until the only sound was the tick of cooling metal and the distant calls of birds in the trees that lined the highway. The riders dismounted in the same organized fashion they had arrived, removing helmets and adjusting jackets, their movements confident and purposeful. The customers in the diner began to panic. A family with small children gathered their belongings and headed for the back exit. An elderly couple fumbled for their cell phone, probably to call the sheriff. 2 truckers who had been eating breakfast left money on their table and hurried toward their rigs. But Louise didn't move. She watched through the window as the sea of leather and chrome organized itself, as men and women she had never seen before arranged themselves with the discipline of soldiers and the camaraderie of family. And then she saw him, Tank, the man who had spoken for the group during that stormy night, walking toward her door with a familiar figure beside him. Tiny followed close behind, his massive frame unmistakable, even among the crowd of bikers. Behind them came Jimmy Bones, Danny Diesel, and the rest of the 9 men who had sheltered in her diner just 2 nights before. But they weren't alone. They had brought their family with them, brothers and sisters from chapters across the Southeast, men and women who had ridden hundreds of miles to be here for reasons Louise was only beginning to understand. The door opened, and Tank stepped inside, followed by his 8 companions from Friday night. The diner fell absolutely silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant tick of the old wall clock. "Ma'am," Tank said, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed space, "we came back to say thank you proper-like." Behind him, the other 8 men spread out respectfully, their presence filling the small diner without crowding it. They looked different in the daylight, less mysterious, more human. Tank's graying hair was neatly combed, and his leather vest displayed dozens of patches that told the story of chapters visited, rides completed, brothers honored. "And we brought some friends," he continued, gesturing toward the parking lot where dozens of bikers waited patiently outside. "They wanted to meet the lady who showed us what real kindness looks like." Louise looked from Tank to the others, seeing in their faces the same mixture of gratitude and respect she had witnessed that stormy night. But now there was something else, a sense of purpose, of mission, as if they had come not just to thank her but to accomplish something larger. "Well," she said, her voice steady, despite the racing of her heart, "I reckon I better put on some more coffee." As she turned toward the coffee machine, Louise caught sight of the remaining customers huddled near the back exit, their faces pale with fear. She understood their reaction. It was the same fear that had driven away her regular customers, the same fear that Jenny Patterson had expressed, the same fear that had made Harold Winters question her judgment. But Louise Washington had learned something important during that long night of service to 9 strangers. Fear was a choice, just like kindness. And today, surrounded by 100 bikers who had come to honor her simple act of human decency, she chose kindness once again. Because sometimes the most unexpected angels arrive in the most intimidating packages. And sometimes the greatest miracles happen when people decide to see past their fears to the humanity that connects us all. What happened next would become the stuff of legend in Millbrook County, a story that would be told and retold for generations, growing more remarkable with each telling, while never losing the essential truth at its heart. That one small act of kindness, offered without condition or expectation, could change the world in ways both seen and unseen. The transformation of Louise's diner that Sunday morning happened with the efficiency of a military operation and the warmth of a family reunion. As Louise moved to prepare more coffee, the bikers outside began filing in with remarkable order and courtesy. They didn't crowd or push. Instead, they formed a respectful line that extended out the door and halfway across the parking lot. Each person who entered approached Louise with the reverence typically reserved for meeting a beloved grandmother. They shook her hand gently, looked her in the eyes, and offered simple words of gratitude. "Thank you for what you did for our brothers. You showed them more kindness than they've seen in years. You gave them something they didn't know they needed." Tank positioned himself near the counter, serving as an unofficial coordinator for the unprecedented gathering. "Brothers and sisters," he announced in a voice that carried easily through the crowded space, "this lady treated us like family when we were nothing but strangers in a storm. She fed us, gave us shelter, and asked for nothing in return. Today, we return that kindness." What followed was unlike anything Millbrook had ever witnessed. The bikers didn't just order food, they celebrated it. They praised Louise's coffee as the best they'd ever tasted, declared her biscuits worthy of heaven, and lined up for seconds and thirds of everything she could prepare. The diner filled with laughter and conversation, with stories shared across traditional boundaries, with the kind of genuine human connection that transcended stereotypes and assumptions. A woman named Sarah Raven Martinez, her arms covered in intricate tattoos, and her graying hair braided with leather and beads, sat at the counter beside a nervous-looking local businessman who had been too shocked to leave. "First time seeing this many bikes?" she asked with a gentle smile. The man nodded, his eyes wide. Yes. Are you really Hell's Angels?" Raven laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a summer breeze. "Honey, we're a lot of things. We're teachers and mechanics, veterans and single mothers, people who found family where society said family couldn't exist. But today, we're just folks who wanted to thank a special lady for her kindness." Across the diner, similar conversations were happening between bikers and the few locals who had stayed. Fear was giving way to curiosity, curiosity to understanding, understanding to something that looked remarkably like friendship. The artificial barriers that had seemed so solid just hours before were crumbling like paper walls in the face of genuine human interaction. Louise moved through it all like a conductor orchestrating a symphony of reconciliation. She served coffee and conversation in equal measure, listening to stories from the road and tales from the town, finding common ground between worlds that had never imagined they could coexist. When Tiny mentioned his love of gardening, she introduced him to Mrs. Henderson, whose prize-winning tomatoes were the envy of the county garden club. When young Diesel talked about his struggle to find honest work, she pointed him toward Bob Murphy, who owned a motorcycle repair shop and was always looking for skilled mechanics. The most remarkable moment came when a little girl named Emma, whose family had been too curious to leave, approached Tank with the fearless curiosity of childhood. "Why do you have so many pictures on your jacket?" she asked, pointing to his patches. Tank knelt down to her level, his weathered face softening with genuine warmth. "These aren't pictures, sweetheart. They're like badges that tell stories about places I've been and friends I've made. See this one? It's for a ride we did to raise money for kids who don't have toys at Christmas." Emma's eyes widened with interest rather than fear. "You give presents to kids?" "Every year," Tank said solemnly. "Because every kid deserves Christmas, don't you think?" The little girl nodded enthusiastically, and her mother, who had been watching nervously from a nearby booth, found herself smiling despite her earlier apprehensions. Sometimes, understanding began with the innocent questions of a child who hadn't yet learned to be afraid. As the morning turned to afternoon, word of the gathering spread through Millbrook like wildfire. Some residents stayed away, peering through curtains and expressing disapproval from a safe distance. But others, driven by curiosity or courage or simple hunger, began trickling into the diner to see what all the commotion was about. Sheriff Bobby Mitchell arrived around noon, his hand resting casually on his radio but his expression more curious than concerned. He surveyed the packed diner, the orderly line of motorcycles outside, the complete absence of trouble or conflict. "Louise," he said, shaking his head in amazement. "I've been sheriff for 12 years, and I've never seen anything like this." "Neither have I, Bobby," Louise replied, refilling his coffee cup. "But sometimes the most beautiful things are the ones we never saw coming." The sheriff looked around at the unprecedented mixing of worlds happening in the small diner, bikers and businessmen sharing tables, children asking questions about motorcycles, elderly residents discovering that the fearsome outlaws were just people with different clothes and transportation. "Any problems?" he asked, though the question seemed almost ridiculous given the peaceful atmosphere. "Not a one," Louise said. "Unless you count running out of cornbread as a problem." As the afternoon wore on, the gathering took on an almost festival-like quality. Someone produced a guitar, and impromptu music sessions broke out in the parking lot. Stories were shared, phone numbers exchanged, and plans made for future visits. The artificial walls between communities weren't just being torn down, they were being replaced with bridges built from understanding and respect. The transformation wasn't complete or universal. Some residents remained fearful and disapproving. Some bikers remained aloof and skeptical. But in Louise's diner that remarkable Sunday, enough barriers fell and enough connections formed to prove that change was possible, that understanding could triumph over prejudice, that kindness really could conquer fear. And at the center of it all stood Louise Washington, the small black woman whose simple act of hospitality had sparked a revolution of human decency that would ripple through Millbrook County for years to come. By evening, when the last motorcycle had rumbled away into the sunset, the diner was quiet again. But it was a different kind of quiet, not the silence of emptiness, but the peaceful hush that follows something wonderful and unprecedented. Louise stood in her doorway, watching the taillights disappear down the highway, knowing that nothing would ever be quite the same again. And for the first time in days, she smiled with the complete certainty that everything was going to be all right. The weeks that followed transformed Louise's diner from a modest local eatery into something approaching legend. News of the unprecedented gathering spread far beyond Millbrook County, carried by word of mouth, social media posts, and eventually picked up by regional news outlets who couldn't resist the story of a black grandmother and a motorcycle club finding common ground in rural Georgia. The coverage wasn't always accurate. Some reports sensationalized the event, others focused too heavily on the novelty of the pairing, but the essential truth remained. One act of kindness had created ripples that extended far beyond what anyone could have imagined. Within a month, Louise's diner was receiving visitors from across the Southeast. Some came hoping to glimpse the famous grandmother who had sheltered the Hells Angels. Others were drawn by the possibility of experiencing the kind of radical hospitality that could bridge such seemingly impossible divides. Tour groups started including the diner on their routes through rural Georgia, and food bloggers wrote lengthy pieces about Louise's biscuits and the atmosphere of acceptance that permeated the small establishment. But the most significant changes were happening within Millbrook itself. The bikers had kept their promise to return, not in overwhelming numbers like that first Sunday, but in small groups of 2 or 3 who stopped by during their travels. They became regular customers, familiar faces, who ordered coffee and pie and treated Louise with the respect and affection typically reserved for beloved family members. Tank became an almost weekly visitor, timing his rides to coincide with Louise's quiet Tuesday afternoons, when they could talk without interruption. He brought her pictures from his travels, stories from the road, and gradually, pieces of his own history that helped her understand the man behind the leather and patches. "My real name is Marcus Rodriguez," he told her one autumn afternoon as they sat in the empty diner sharing coffee and apple pie. "I was a high school math teacher before I joined the club. Taught for 15 years in East Los Angeles." Louise raised an eyebrow. "A math teacher?" Tank smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "Hard to picture, right? But I loved those kids, and I was good at it. Problem was, the system wasn't good at loving kids like them. Too many bureaucrats, too much testing, not enough caring. I burned out, got bitter, made some choices I'm not proud of." He paused, stirring sugar into his coffee with the careful attention of someone choosing his words. "The club saved me, Louise. Gave me a family when I didn't have one, a purpose when I'd lost mine. We're not perfect people, and we've all got histories we're not proud of. But we take care of each other, and we try to take care of others when we can. Like the Christmas toy drive Emma mentioned. That's just one thing we do. We raise money for veterans' families, escort abused kids to court hearings, make hospital visits to members who are sick. The media doesn't usually report on that stuff. It doesn't fit the narrative they want to tell about us." Louise nodded, understanding. She had lived her entire life watching how narratives got constructed, how fear could transform complex human beings into simple villains or heroes. "People see what they expect to see," she said. "Takes courage to look deeper." "That's what you did that night," Tank said. "You looked deeper. You saw 9 wet, tired men instead of dangerous criminals. You chose kindness instead of fear." The impact of that choice continued to reverberate through Millbrook in ways both subtle and profound. Jenny Patterson, the young mother who had expressed her fears so passionately, found herself returning to the diner after her children begged to meet the motorcycle people they'd heard so much about. Her first encounter with Sarah Raven Martinez, who had spent 20 years as a pediatric nurse before joining the club, challenged every assumption she'd held about who could be trusted with her children's safety. Harold Winters, the hardware store owner who had initially warned Louise about the dangers of welcoming bikers, discovered that several club members were skilled mechanics and craftsmen who became valuable customers for his specialized tools and equipment. His relationship with Louise never quite returned to its former warmth, but he learned to respect decisions he didn't understand. Mayor Thompson, ever sensitive to public opinion, initially distanced himself from the controversy. But when regional tourism began increasing specifically because of the diner's fame, and when those tourists started spending money at local businesses, his tune changed considerably. He even went so far as to proclaim Louise's Diner an important cultural landmark and suggested that the city council consider some sort of official recognition. The most meaningful changes, though, happened in the quiet moments between individuals. When Tiny helped Mrs. Henderson plant her fall garden, sharing techniques he'd learned from his grandmother in rural Alabama. When young Diesel found work at Bob Murphy's motorcycle shop and proved himself so reliable and skilled that Bob made him assistant manager within 6 months. When Jimmy Bones Thompson started volunteering at the local VFW, finally finding a place where his military service was honored rather than ignored. These connections didn't erase the fears and prejudices that existed in Millbrook. Change rarely happens that completely or that quickly. But they created cracks in the foundation of those prejudices, spaces where understanding could take root and grow. Louise watched it all unfold with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had planted seeds without knowing what might grow from them. Her diner had become more than a place to eat. It had become a symbol of possibility, proof that walls between communities were often more fragile than they appeared. On quiet evenings, when the last customer had left, and she was cleaning up for the night, Louise would sometimes pause in her work and reflect on the strange turns life could take. A woman who had spent her life serving food had somehow become a catalyst for social change. A simple act of hospitality had sparked conversations about prejudice, acceptance, and the courage required to treat strangers as family. She thought about Robert, her late husband, and wondered what he would make of all this attention. He had been a quiet man who believed in doing right without fanfare, in helping others without expecting recognition. She suspected he would be proud of what she had done, but he would also remind her that the work wasn't finished, that every day brought new opportunities to choose kindness over fear, understanding over assumption. And so Louise Washington continued to do what she had always done. She opened her doors each morning, brewed fresh coffee, cooked honest food, and welcomed whoever walked through her door, with the same grace and dignity she had shown 9 strangers on a stormy night. Because that's what love looked like in practice, not grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but the daily choice to see the humanity in every person who needed shelter from whatever storms they faced. The diner hummed with its familiar rhythms, but now those rhythms included the regular rumble of motorcycles alongside the rattle of pickup trucks and the whisper of family sedans. Millbrook had learned to accommodate this new reality, and most days, the differences between customers seemed less important than their shared appreciation for Louise's cooking and the atmosphere of acceptance she had somehow created. Winter came and went, then spring, and the first anniversary of the storm approached. Louise found herself busier than she had ever been, serving not just food but hope to people who traveled from hundreds of miles away to experience what had become known as the Millbrook miracle. She tried not to let the attention go to her head. After all, she was still the same woman who had always believed in treating people right, who had spent her life proving that kindness was stronger than fear. The only difference was that now the whole world seemed to be watching, waiting to see what lessons could be learned from a small diner in rural Georgia where a black grandmother and a motorcycle club had found common ground. And the most important lesson, Louise knew, was the simplest one of all. That every person who walked through her door was somebody's child, somebody's hope, somebody's story of struggle and survival. When you saw people that way, really saw them, everything else became possible. The morning of the 1-year anniversary dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of perfect spring weather that made everything seem possible. Louise arrived at the diner before sunrise, as had become her custom, when she knew the day would be special. She had no idea what to expect. Tank had mentioned that a few folks might stop by to commemorate the occasion, but with bikers, Louise had learned, a few folks could mean anything from 3 people to 300. She spent the early hours preparing for whatever the day might bring, mixing extra batter for pancakes, brewing large batches of coffee, and making sure her freezer was stocked with enough ingredients to handle a crowd. The local newspaper had run a feature story about the anniversary, and the regional television station had called to ask about filming a segment, though Louise had politely declined. Some stories, she felt, were too sacred for cameras. Around 8 o'clock, the first motorcycles began arriving. Not the massive convoy of the previous year, but a steady stream of familiar faces: Tank and his original 8 companions, Sarah Raven Martinez, and dozens of other club members who had become regular visitors over the past 12 months. They parked their bikes with the same careful precision Louise remembered, and entered the diner with the comfortable familiarity of people returning home. But they weren't alone. Mixed among the bikers were faces Louise recognized from town: Jenny Patterson with her 2 children, who now considered several club members to be honorary uncles and aunts. Bob Murphy, whose motorcycle repair business had tripled in size thanks to referrals from the biker community. Mrs. Henderson, carrying a basket of fresh vegetables from the garden Tiny had helped her plant. Sheriff Bobby Mitchell arrived in his personal car rather than his patrol vehicle, bringing his wife Martha and their teenage son, who had developed a fascination with motorcycles that his parents had learned to accept, if not entirely understand. Mayor Thompson made an appearance, clearly hoping to be photographed with the group that had brought so much positive attention to Millbrook. As the morning progressed, the gathering took on the feeling of a family reunion which, in many ways, it had become. Conversations flowed easily between groups that had once viewed each other with suspicion or fear. Children played in the parking lot under the watchful eyes of both parents and bikers, who had proven surprisingly gentle and protective when it came to the youngest residents of Millbrook. Emma, the little girl who had asked Tank about his patches the previous year, was now 8 years old and completely comfortable chatting with anyone who wore leather and rode a motorcycle. She had even started a small collection of patches herself, gifts from bikers who had visited the diner and wanted to share a piece of their travels with someone who appreciated their stories. "Miss Louise," she said, tugging on Louise's apron. As the morning rush began to settle into a comfortable pace, Tank said he's got something special planned for today. What do you think it is? Louise smiled, ruffling the child's hair. I reckon we'll find out when Tank's ready to tell us, honey. Some surprises are worth waiting for. The surprise came just before noon, when Tank stood up in the center of the crowded diner and called for everyone's attention. The conversations gradually died down as people turned to listen, creating the kind of expectant silence that preceded important announcements. Friends, Tank began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to addressing groups. 1 year ago today, 9 tired, wet, and grateful men found shelter in this diner. We were strangers to Louise Washington, and she had every reason to turn us away. Instead, she chose to see our humanity rather than our reputation. She chose kindness over fear, love over judgment. He paused, looking around the room at the diverse group of faces, bikers and business owners, children and grandparents, people who had found common ground in their shared appreciation for the woman who had brought them together. That choice changed all of our lives, Tank continued. It reminded us that family isn't just about blood or patches or shared experiences. Family is about choosing to care for each other, even when the world tells us we shouldn't. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small wrapped package, which he handed to Louise with the solemnity of someone presenting a sacred relic. This is from all of us, not just the club, but everyone whose life has been touched by your example. It's a small token of gratitude for a gift that can never be repaid. Louise unwrapped the package with careful fingers, revealing a hand-carved wooden plaque. The inscription, burned into the rich walnut with careful artistry, read, Louise Washington. Proof that kindness is the most powerful force in the universe. From your grateful family at the Hells Angels MC, and the people of Millbrook County. But below the words was something even more meaningful, dozens of signatures, carefully etched into the wood. The names of every club member who had visited the diner over the past year, alongside the signatures of local residents who had learned to see past their fears to the humanity beneath. Louise held the plaque against her chest, feeling the weight of all those names, all those stories, all those connections that had grown from one stormy night and 9 strangers in need of shelter. When she looked up, her eyes were bright with tears she didn't try to hide. You know, she said, her voice steady, despite her emotion, a year ago, I just thought I was serving coffee and soup to some folks who needed to get out of the rain. I had no idea I was planting seeds for something this beautiful. She looked around the room, taking in the faces of people who had become family in ways she never could have imagined. But that's the thing about kindness, you never know where it's going to grow, or how far it's going to spread, or whose life it's going to change. All you can do is offer it freely, and trust that good things will come from good intentions. The applause that followed was spontaneous and heartfelt, a sound that seemed to embrace everyone in the room regardless of their background or beliefs. It was the sound of people recognizing themselves in a story larger than any individual. A story about the possibility of transformation and the power of human connection to overcome even the deepest divisions. As the afternoon wore on and people gradually began to disperse, Louise found herself standing in her doorway once again, watching as motorcycles and cars pulled out of the parking lot and headed back to their various destinations. But this time, she wasn't watching strangers disappear into an uncertain future. She was watching family members return to their homes, carrying with them the knowledge that they always had a place to come back to. Tank was the last to leave, as he had been that first morning after the storm. He approached Louise with the same quiet respect he had shown from the beginning, but now there was also the comfortable familiarity of someone who had found an unexpected mother figure in his later years. Thank you, Louise, he said simply. For everything. For that first night, for all the nights since, for showing us what real love looks like. Louise reached up and hugged him, this weathered man who had traveled thousands of miles on dangerous highways, but had never found a safer place than her simple diner. Thank you for giving an old woman the chance to learn that family comes in all shapes and sizes, she replied. As Tank's motorcycle disappeared around the bend, Louise stood for a long moment in the doorway, listening to the familiar sounds of a small town settling into evening, dogs barking in the distance, children being called in for dinner, the whisper of wind through the trees that lined the highway. Tomorrow would bring new customers, new stories, new opportunities to choose kindness over fear. Some would be strangers in need of shelter, others would be neighbors learning to see beyond their assumptions. All would be welcome at Louise's diner, where the coffee was always hot, the food was made with love, and every person who walked through the door was treated like family. Because that's what Louise Washington had learned from 9 strangers on a stormy night. That the most powerful force in the universe wasn't thunder or lightning, or the roar of motorcycle engines. It was the simple decision to see the sacred in the ordinary, the holy in the human, the extraordinary in the everyday act of caring for one another. And in a small diner in rural Georgia, that lesson continued to transform hearts and minds, one cup of coffee, one act of kindness, one stranger turned family at a time.